Lovely. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this morning for the first of our 3 sessions for newly open free schools hosted in partnership with NSN and the Department for Education. I'm really pleased to have you all and see so many people on the call this morning. Today, we will be talking about the importance of leadership. I'm sure all of you who have opened free schools over the past few years will know just how important having strong and consistent leadership is. The aim of today's session really is to give you a bit of a chance to take a step back from the day-to-day and to reflect on what leadership means for you and your school, and to think about some strategies for your schools as they grow over the coming years as well. So I hope today's session is useful. For information, my name is Hannah Jackson. I am Head of School Programmes here at New Schools Network, and will be chairing these upcoming events. So we're really pleased as well to be joined by our 2 speakers this morning. We have the honour of being joined by Sir Hamid Patel, Chief Executive of Star Academies, which, as I'm sure all of you will know, is an academy trust, a multi-academy trust running schools across the country, including nearly 20 free schools, with a couple more on the way. So I'm sure Sir Hamid's reflections will be incredibly valuable this morning. We're also joined by Alex Crossman, former head teacher of the East Charter School, Dulwich, and now head teacher of the London Academy of Excellence, which is a 16 to 19 free school in Stratford, which is where I am speaking to you from this morning. So we are, just in terms of housekeeping, we are recording today's session, as you'll be aware. As I mentioned, please do keep cameras on. There will be some more interactive bits of the session later, we'll be going into breakout rooms, so just to make you aware of that. We are taking questions sort of throughout today's session, so please do put those in the chat. If you have any questions that you'd rather ask anonymously, you can also just send those directly to me using the chat function, and I will ask those on your behalf. So I think that's everything that you need to know for today's session. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sir Hamid. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Hannah. And guys, I've got about 25 minutes or so. So I'm going to speak for 25 minutes. And if at any point you want to stop me, then go ahead, just stop me. I'll answer the question as I'm speaking. Equally speaking, as Hannah said, I'm happy for you to add the questions to the comments section, and I'll take the questions at the end. Now, my job is to be a warm-up act for Alex, because Alex's session is a real session. It's the strategy session. It's a session that you will find most useful. But I will nevertheless share some thoughts with you. We have some experiences of setting up free schools. As Hannah said, over the recent years, we have set up around 20 free schools, and I've seen free schools set up from scratch to and seen them grow with schools that are now full with 6 forms and have been operating for several years. So I've worked with these schools over a period of time, and I'm happy to sort of share thoughts with you in relation to that journey of ours. But all of this is in the spirit of sharing our sort of experiences with you. Not to tell you what to do. Every context is different. Every place is different. You have your own set of challenges, but nevertheless, there'll be things that I say, hopefully, that will resonate with you. And I'm hoping that you might find some of these thoughts useful. But so let's sort of start off with the challenges. The first thing I would say is that as you grow the school, you need to protect the culture of the school. Culture is everything. You know, when we set up these schools, we set these schools up with a load of ambitions. You know, there's things that are important to us. That's why we've set these schools up in the first place. You know, they're about improving social mobility. They're about changing lives. they're about transforming futures, they're about giving kids opportunities, they're about breaking glass ceilings. All of these things are important to us, and that's why we've set these schools up. And then there are things that are important to us and that underpin our model. They are that's your ethos of your organization, the values of your organization, your beliefs. They all serve as guiding principles for an organization. It's the glue that holds the organization together. And if you don't have a plan to protect your culture, the glue will come apart. So the first point is you have to have a plan. As you're sort of growing your school, you have to have a plan to protect your culture. You're going to have more staff, you're going to have more parents, you're going to have more pupils, more partners, all need managing, all need unifying. These are parents and pupils that are going to be different to the parents and pupils that you had in the early days. In the early days, so many of these parents and pupils, they selected you. And as you sort of grow and as you take on new cohorts of pupils and parents, some of them may not have even selected you, or you may just be the only choice for them in the local community. So all of this has an impact in your in the way that they will interact with you and in the way you will need to go in the way you will need to work with them. So your organization will change as it grows, and you need to make sure that you have a strong vision for the culture of your organization. You need to have a strong vision for leadership. What is your moral purpose? What are your values? And every organization has a set of values. We have what we call our STAR values: service, teamwork, ambition, and respect. And all schools have mission statements and strap lines that express their values. These mean nothing unless they are lived. So you got to make sure that, everyone in the organization, one way of protecting your values is to make sure that everyone in the organization lives those values. It's just so important that happens. But throughout your sort of journey of growth, you have to exemplify what is meant by your values, translating them into policies, embedding them into your school's specialisms. So my first point is that make sure that you have a strong vision for your school, you have a strong culture, you have a strong vision for your leadership. Make sure that you have a plan to protect that. And that's that, essentially, you need to make sure that you've defined your culture clearly, you've articulated your values, and you live by them. Your leaders live by them. You incorporate them into your induction policies and procedures. You make sure that you talk to your people, you talk to your staff, you talk to your pupils, you talk to your parents, you talk to your stakeholders. You keep on checking the implementation of those values and that culture. And of course, you've got to be willing to adapt your culture. Your culture, more people will bring they will add and they will enrich your culture. And you've got to be willing to adapt your culture, but not lose what you're about. You must never lose, do not ever compromise on the central premise that all children deserve the best, they're capable of achieving the best, irrespective of who they are, where they come from, and what they believe. So that central premise is not going to be, that will never be sort of compromised. But you may need to accept that culture of your organization will change over time, and you will need to adapt that culture. Relating to culture, there's also the people piece, and they're both related. And as you grow your school, you are going to recruit lots of new staff. From year 1 to year 2, you've doubled your staff. then you bring a new cohort of staff, and you're going to do all of this culture work with each of these new group of staff that you bring. Remember, the first set of staff that join you, they will be with you from day one. They will have seen that, they will have seen you set up that school from scratch. They might have even been with you, even before you got the building, even before you, when you were sort of recruiting without, they are the core. They are people, the ones that stay, they are the core, they're the spine of your organization. And then you're going to bring people on board. Some of them will be signed up to that. Some of them may not be signed up to that. And you're going to make sure that through your recruitment processes, you recruit people who are fundamentally sort of aligned to what you're about. So we expect that our teachers that enter our schools, they come from a position of academic strength. And if this sounds elitist, it is. Our teachers have to be subject experts whose passion matches their pedagogical excellence. And we make no bones about expecting them to work hard, plan all lessons diligently, and teach every lesson in a way that makes it matter. We invest in their development, and we show them that we care. So you've got to take real care in recruitment. And, you can get very desperate. In the early days, you bring people on board, and very quickly, some people come and they realize that this isn't the organization for me. Not a new business startup is not for everyone. So very quickly, they want to come. They want to jump off the ship. They want to come off the bus. Now that means that within your first few months, within your first few weeks, you're looking for new staff. Now you're desperate, and you don't want to recruit out of desperation because you're going to recruit the wrong people. And then as you grow year on year, there's a lot of pressure to fill vacancies quickly for the following year. And you've got to make sure that you take care, you take time, you appoint the right people into the organization. One person can completely destroy your culture. They can disrupt the culture. They can completely change or disrupt what you've created. So every person that you bring, you need to think carefully, make sure the selection process is strong, make sure that if you're not 100%, then don't recruit. Unless you feel very, very good about the appointment you're making. Is this person aligned to what I'm about? Is this person aligned to what the school is about? Does this person have the right character? Does the person have the right attitude? Do they have the right competency? Do they have the right proficiency? You might be able to train someone on competency matters, but attitude is very, very difficult to shift. So you've got to make sure that you bring in the right people. You've got to make sure that you get the right balance between very experienced people and sort of new talent, younger talent that might be more enthusiastic, more creative, and so on. And that's not me making any sort of statements about more experienced staff or inexperienced staff. I'm just saying you've got to make sure that you've got a balanced team. In the early days, when I set up the boys' school, I had the view that because I had a very successful girls' school, I used to be the head teacher of a girls' school, and the girls' school, when I was set up 30 years ago, 35 years ago, essentially it was a free school. It was set up with around 90 kids and in a local community in sort of terraced houses. And it was in terraced houses until 2011-12. It actually moved out of terrace houses in 2012. I became the head teacher in 2006. Now, there were many, many terrace houses. By the time we moved into a new site, we had 600 girls. I took over the headship when the school only had 300 girls. But there was a whole street of houses that were purchased in the community. It wasn't a fit-for-purpose building. There weren't any play facilities. We made it work. The culture was very powerful, very strong, real community buy-in, all of those things that make our free school special, we had there. Now the school has, you know, acres and acres of green land, and it's in a completely different space to what it was. But when I took over that girls' school, we had some fantastic staff in there that we trained up. We trained all of the staff. We grew our own middle leaders from there. We grew our own senior leaders, a much younger profile of staff that we had at the girls' school. Over the years, from 2006 till 2009-10, the school had become, within sort of 2 to 3 years, the school became one of the highest achieving in the country. Now the school is the top performing school in the country for Progress 8. It's been the top performing school in the country for Progress 8 since the measure was introduced. Students progress to prestigious universities. They thrive and find their own unique talents and identities. They define their own futures. They engage in thousands of hours of voluntary service through which they repay the community that has believed in them. Very, very special school, very aspirational, very ambitious, and our sort of flagship school, founding school. And based on that, we set up the first free school, which was the boys' school. Now, when we set up the boys' school, I thought I knew everything from the girls' school because I was a very successful head teacher. I was executive head teacher. I'd also been responsible for a very different school, a white working class school, a white working class secondary school in Blackburn. Back in 2009, there was an article in the Times newspaper, and the article was written by Jack Straw, who's a trustee of Star now, and Jack Straw was the MP of Blackburn at that time, and he wrote an article to say that Blackburn had one of the top performing schools, and they were the top 3 performing schools. This was back in 2009, 2008-9. They were top 3 performing schools, and 2 of them were grammar schools, and this was Tiggs there, and he was asked to write a piece, and he wrote a celebratory piece. Now, that piece in the Times had the top 10 schools in the country and had the bottom 10 schools in the country as well. And the bottom 10 schools also had a Blackburn school. Now, the Times editor hadn't picked up that Blackburn had a school which was in the top 10, and it had a school which was in the worst 10 as well. So fortunately for Jack, they asked him to write an article on the top school, but not on the fact that he also had one of the worst performing schools in his borough. Now, I was asked a year later to support that school. This was the white working class school. And when I took that school over, people said to me, listen, you know, Hamid, you've worked in a girls' school. It's a very different proposition. Yours are Asian kids. These are white working class kids. This school has 11%, 5 A to C with English and maths. The school has had restarts, new starts, fresh starts. It's had the whole stuff. What makes you think you're going to be able to turn it around? Is it not going to undermine your sort of reputation? Is it not going to, is it not going to harm you? And I said, look, what good is a reputation if you can't use the reputation to change the lives of kids? And, in the end, I can't have a situation in Blackburn where you have a fantastic school where kids do really, really well, and you have another school where the kids aren't doing as well. It's an equality issue for me. And it's also a community cohesion issue for me as well, because ultimately you've got a school here with Asian kids that's doing relatively well, really well, one of the best performing schools in the country. The Progress 8 score, today's Progress 8 score in 2019, was plus 2.9, plus 2.1, plus 2.2 type of Progress 8 score. So that's that's the sort of level of achievement that we're talking about at the girls' school. So when somebody said to me, are you sure that you want to take on this white working class school? I said, yes, absolutely. And we took that school on. We did all the things that you do: good leadership, good teaching, good curriculum, a good extracurricular program, focus on attendance, a focus on behavior, a focus on the small things before they become big things, good parental engagement, good family engagement, early intervention, all of those things that are good things to do, and our free schools do really, really well. We did. And that school, in a period of 3 years, became the joint most improved school in the country, from 11% to 53% in 3 years. And on the back of that, we set up the first free school, and I thought I knew it all. And I said to everyone, guys, we need to make sure that we appoint some really, really young, talented, very, very capable teachers. Let's do that. And we appointed a team of young, talented individuals. Now, fantastic. They were great. But what I hadn't realized was that I was using the girls' school as the basis for the boys' school. But the girls' school had a history of 15, 20 years. And in there were experienced staff as well as younger staff. And what I had done was created a school here with lots and lots of young staff, but nobody to actually coach them, nobody to mentor them. So, you've got even the senior leaders very, very inexperienced. Even their teacher was very inexperienced. Everyone was inexperienced. And from there onwards, what we started to do was, as we set up new schools, we started to think about what that balance was, because we needed to make sure that we had young staff, talented, very capable subject experts and all of that. But we also had a small number of staff that were able to sort of do the coaching, that were able to do the mentoring and so on. So as you grow, you need to think about the people piece as well. How are you planning your talent? How are you growing your talent? How are you growing your own middle leaders? Remember, you want to appoint senior leaders that you have grown. Yes, you need some new blood. You want to bring new blood from outside. That's fantastic. You want to do that, but you want to grow your own as well. That spine that I sort of referred to earlier, you need to invest in that spine. They are your core, and they're fundamental to the success and sustainability of your school. So it's important to think about your people piece carefully. As I mentioned, the culture piece, expect your staff to be consummate professionals every day, support them to achieve that. In terms of culture, articulate your expectations clearly, make sure you're very precise around your expectations, expect confusion and inconsistency if you don't prescribe detail. We're in the detail game. Detail, rigor, thoroughness, that matters. That will set your school apart from the school next door. Communicate clearly, communicate concisely. And on the sort of people piece, remember that your staff are people with different circumstances, different experiences, different skills. Value them. You won't have, everyone has an ideal staff room. And, sometimes you're lucky and you might end up with an ideal staff room. But the reality of the situation is that you have some really, really good staff, and you'll have some staff that you would exchange if you had the opportunity to exchange, but you're dealing with recruitment issues, you're dealing with all of those issues. And therefore, you have to accept that sometimes you have the share that you have, but you need to make sure that you use each person to their strengths, recognize that everyone has a talent, experience, and skills, value them, share and celebrate their success. I'm going to quickly sort of try and address a few other points. Be ambitious, be bold. That's why you set up a free school in the first place. And when you've been running a school for a year, 2 years, and you guys are fantastic. You guys have opened these schools up in the middle of a pandemic. Now that is powerful, and you've done a great job in that period. But things do get tough, and you will make mistakes, and it's okay to make mistakes. And staff will leave you as well, and there will be some days that are really, really tough. But actually, you become stronger as a result of the adversity. So what I would say to you is that remain optimistic even when things aren't going well. Be ambitious, be bold, don't compromise on your vision. It's a vision. That's why you set up the school. Believe in it. Don't compromise on it. You may need to make changes, but make sure that you don't make them too early. Make sure that you don't make the changes make so many changes that the actual sort of reform becomes pointless in the first place. Walk the walk. It's important, in order to protect your culture, you need people who are going to walk the walk. You need to have great role models in your schools, teachers and leaders that others are going to learn from, they're going to emulate from. It's important that you have an instructional approach to your leadership. Your leaders in school have an instructional approach to their leadership. You need people who are going to roll up their sleeves, who are going to model the behaviors they expect to see. It's not good enough to say this is what we expect. We need to make sure that we're fighting the fight. We're in the trenches with the troops. They need to see us with them. And that if our instructions, people will then follow our instructions, and they'll think that they're completely sensible because we are consistently walking the walk. When we induct new starters into our schools, we remind them how hard an NQT has to work simply to remain afloat. If you think of an NQT or an early career teacher in the current language, an early career teacher has 20 hours of planning, 20 hours of teaching, 20 hours of marking, and possibly 5 or 6 hours of enrichment. So an early career teacher is doing 65, 70 hours. And then, so it's not about hours, it's about quality. I accept that it's not about, you need to get the well-being of your staff right, but equally speaking, it's about recognizing that leaders in the school are going to have to walk the walk. If you're going to expect NQTs and early career teachers who are on a pittance to work that way, then senior leaders are going to need to do the same. You need to as you grow the school, you need to remember that you must still sweat the detail. What matters is what happens on the ground. Don't lose sight of that. You need to spend some time on the balcony. It's important to spend some time on the balcony, but you also need to spend some time on the dance floor. You need to be strategic, but you need to be operational as well. You need to be able to do both. And detail is important. How a letter reads is important. It's important that there isn't a letter with punctuation and grammar problems that go out to your parents. It's important that kids are dressed up smart, staff are dressed up smart. All of the you must still sweat the detail. Get the balance right between standardization and respecting difference. You want to give your staff the ability to grow. It's important that you give them real direction. It's important that they are instructional leaders in your school. It's important that there's instructional coaching. It's important that you have playbooks. It's important that you you have scripts. It's important to have all of these things, but it's also important to allow your staff to innovate, create. And it's a balance. You've got to try and get the balance right. Stay focused on a small set of outcomes, on a small set of key performance indicators. There's so many new things that are happening all the time that the danger is that you're looking for the next new thing. You need to stay focused. What are you about? 4 or 5 things. I'm going to really, really stay focused on those 4 or 5 things. And for the next 2 years, the world around me might move. And yes, I'm going to have to adapt to some extent, but I'm going to be relentlessly focused on outcomes, curriculum, teaching, learning, whatever those areas are that you have determined as areas that you need to focus on. Don't try and do too much. Stay focused. Remember, this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. You're going to be in this. You're going to be doing this job for the next 5 years, 7 years, 8 years. You're going to have to put the hours in. But equally speaking, you got to make sure that you look after yourself in that process, and at the same time you remain focused and you don't move from one thing to the other. Invest time in building positive relationships. Remember, it's all about people. Our business is about people. You need your staff to deliver. If your staff don't follow you, then you're not able to exercise your leadership. You can only follow if your followers follow you. And you only have the moral authority for leadership if you walk the walk and you do some of the things that I have mentioned. Try not to become too officious. Try not to become too bureaucratic. Naturally, as the school grows, you will add systems, you will add processes, you will add new policies. You will have to do all of this because some of the things that you are able to do when the school is small, you're not able to do when you've got a large school with 1,000, 1,200 in your school with 120 staff. You're not able to do what you're able to do for sort of with 20 staff, and therefore you're going to have to flex your systems and processes and make sure that they work for the new organization. Naturally, you'll also feel that you're not as on the ball as you were when you only had 20 staff. Now you've got 120 staff. So the danger is that you start to introduce new pro formas and new procedures and new templates for people to complete and so on. Remember, you want your staff to spend majority of their time not in offices completing paperwork for you. You want your middle leaders to be in the classrooms instructing the classroom, instructing the teaching. Keep asking yourself, am I helping or am I complicating things? Do not overcomplicate things. Keep looking for value in what you do. Otherwise, stay out of the way. In everything that happens, your job is to think strategic, think long-term, think systemic, so that we learn from every mistake and extenuate the benefit of every opportunity. Always ask in the middle of a fire or the storm. And I know it's difficult, but in the middle of the fire, in the middle of the storm, you need to have the capacity to step back. What am I missing? What can we learn from this? How do we avoid and mitigate this? Can I learn from this mistake? How do we avoid making this mistake again? How does this become part of our sort of organizational know-how? Try and instill a culture of taking responsibility and learning from every mistake. So leaders continuously get better. Teachers continuously get better. It's okay. People will make mistakes unless they've done something illegal, which cannot be tolerated. Everything else, it can be rectified, remedied. So it's okay for people to make mistakes, but take responsibility and make sure that you put the steps in place to ensure that the mistake isn't made the second time or the third time, and that you as an organization have learned as a result of it. Be resilient. All the biggest issues will come to you because they should come to you. So be confident in your smartness and do not let the misfortunes make you anxious or angry or upset. If people sense you respond badly to bad news, they'll not bring it to you. Stay optimistic, believe in a brighter future. If you do not believe it, fake it. You have to do that, And 2 more points: develop leadership at all levels. Focus on the learner, the teacher, the early career teacher, the middle leader, the non-teaching staff. The non-teaching staff as important to you as teaching staff is. You need to have progression pathways for both teaching staff and non-teaching staff. Develop all of them as leaders. Include them in your decision-making process. Expose them to the dilemmas leaders address each day, and sometimes you can't expose them to everything. I recognize, but where possible, try and expose them. Stimulate them to consider and evaluate decisions and actions. Exhibit faith in others. They should feel that you believe in them. Encourage. It's okay, by the way, for teachers and leaders to develop, progress, and move on. A strong leadership is sustained rather than undermined by having to replace teachers and leaders regularly. The last thing you want is to have people in your school that are there and, they're not moving on, but you haven't developed them and progressed them either. So think about that really sort of carefully. Well-being is important. Your well-being is important as head teachers. Nobody's going to look after you if you don't look after yourself. It's as simple as that. This is a lonely game, and yes, you can be part of networks, and yes, you can have a coach if you need a coach, and get yourself a coach. It's important that everyone has a coach. Everyone is coaching in your school. Everybody has a coach. Equally speaking, it's important that you have a coach. So get a coach, have a diary, a journal, keep it up to date. Try and write your reflections. Those reflections may be useful to you in 6 months' time, in 12 months' time, or even after 2 or 3 years. So have some boundaries. After X, 7 o'clock on a Thursday, 7 o'clock on a Wednesday, 6 o'clock on a Tuesday, Monday. I don't work unless there is X, Y, and Z. Try and make sure that you spend some time at weekend, which is your time, me time. But equally speaking, make sure that you look after the well-being of all your staff, including your NQTs and including your early career teachers. And finally, last point, stay humble. And I say this, this is a lecture, but all of these things that I say, I haven't got perfect for my own self. I try and, as they say, my ears are closest to me. And hence, these messages are as important for me as anyone else. And I genuinely believe that. I would say stay humble. We are heads because we are talented. You guys aren't, you haven't just been made heads. You've been made heads. And you're running schools, and you are heads of new schools, even more difficult than actually going into an established school because you're talented. But we don't have all the best ideas or all the answers or make the best teacher or most knowledgeable even. As heads, our biggest achievement will be to build and nurture the best, most diverse, and most motivated teams. Thank you for that.
Lovely. Thank you, Sir Hamid. That was incredibly insightful. Thank you so much for sharing. Alex, I'll hand over to you. I think just in the interest of time, if you could put questions for Alex or Sir Hamid in the chat as we go, and we'll sort of address them as we go through. Alex, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you for your introduction earlier. I do have slides. I am just going to share those slides with you now. So as I explained to Hannah and Graham earlier, I'm out of practice with Zoom, so I am now assuming that you can see my slides, and if you can't, somebody please chirp up.
Yes, we can. Thanks, Alex. That's
very kind of you. Thank you, Hannah. The reassurance is always helpful. So before I sort of delve into the presentation, I mean, it's customary in these circumstances to have a couple of credibility slides. And by that I mean, why am I here? Why should you be here? And why should you be listening and paying attention rather than answering that vast backlog of emails that is building up even as I speak? And I think I'm here for 3 reasons. The first and probably most important is that I am the only serving head teacher in the country who was foolish enough to try and follow a speech by Sir Hamid Patel. The second is that just click forward, is that I'm a career changer. So although I didn't change career particularly recently, I have been doing this for a while. But I spent the first half of my career in institutional finance, mostly in strategy roles, before moving into an analogous role in a large international education provider, which is a long-winded way of saying that my advice used to be very expensive and is now virtually cheap. Make of that what you will. But it also means that I have and actually have worked quite hard to maintain. As much as I feel very comfortable, very happy with the career transition that I made some time ago, I have always tried to cultivate and maintain something of an outsider's perspective on our education system, because I think it's helpful and it's relatively unusual. And I will also be drawing on the experience. Probably the third and perhaps most dubious reason for listening to anything I have to say is I do at this point have a reasonably extensive experience of establishing and running free schools. So I was the founding head teacher of something called the Charter School East Dulwich, which opened its doors in 2016, although under the old free schools framework, I had the immense luxury, now unthinkable, of a year of setup, so I was appointed a year earlier than that. And I am now the head teacher of the London Academy of Excellence. And this part I don't mind showing off about at all, because it has very little as yet to do with me. And that is that the LAE, as we refer to it, is I think by almost all statistical and other measures, the highest performing maintained sixth form provision in the country to offer a full A-level curriculum. So much like Sir Hamid's comments about STAR's recruitment policy, we are an unashamedly academically elitist institution, though our elitism, the selective nature of our intake, is in our case a direct mechanism through which we tackle socioeconomic inequality. So we explicitly recruit from families with no particular tradition of participation in higher education in this country, for families on low income, for students who have been received free school meals, and those that, if they have not, have not been able to receive free school meals for essentially idiosyncratic reasons. So in terms of household income and other factors, we have a fairly homogenous school population, though they exhibit the diversity that you would expect given our location in East London. And we take those students, support their immense native ambition into university careers in some of the best universities in the country and indeed around the world. So with that, let me just address what I'm going to try and do in this next little period of time, and that is to address what it really means to be a startup school, and the use of the terminology there is deliberate. I think it's important that we understand what are the distinctive challenges of operating a startup school, both in the education sector, and why that might be different from startup enterprises elsewhere. I want to talk a little bit about strategy, and specifically growth strategy. I want to talk about two terms which might sound slightly forbidding, but are intuitively accessible, and that's what we mean by a deliberate or an emergent strategy. And I want to finish, hopefully, by talking a little bit about how heads and principals can best work with governors for reasons that, if they're not already apparent, if people aren't already nodding, I will address as we get to that point of the presentation. So I think it's helpful, it's sobering, to think a little bit about the enterprise you all engaged in, and that I am sort of coming to a slightly different stage of, in relation to the economy more widely. So the comparatively simple chart we have in front of us refers to the number of new start enterprises in the economy widely, in the commercial economy, versus in the schooling sector. Now, fair disclosure, the slide's about 18 months old, so it might have changed very slightly. But for purposes of comparison, in the economy more widely, almost 40% of all enterprises, not by share of GDP, but just the number of enterprises operating today, will be under 5 years old. And if we were to look at the school sector, even after successive waves of free schools openings, it's under 1%. So significantly less than 1% of schools in the country will be new schools, meaning that they have been open for less than 5 years. And that has some fairly profound implications for all of us and for all of our colleagues. The first, very simply, is that it means that there are fewer entrepreneurs or people familiar with the process of opening and running a school than there would be if we were in another sector of the economy. Some time ago, before I became a teacher, I spent about a year doing sort of consulting work for high-tech startups in Silicon Valley. And there it was exactly the opposite. Nobody really wanted to speak to established businesses, but there's a very active ecosystem, very active process of information exchange among peers involved in new startups. We don't have that. We have a growing and increasingly expert reserve of colleagues who have been through this journey. Significant number of them within Star Academy's trust as a case in point. But we also have a very significant number of stakeholders who will not have that experience and for whom it may well be quite disconcerting. So to be very direct about that, parents, community leaders, other schools, both those with whom you partner and those with whom you may compete, and other teachers are likely to have little or no experience of new entrants. There is something I was too polite to write on the slide, but I am sufficiently impolite to mention when we're in this context. Many teachers are in significant part their choice of profession reflects the fact that they are very comfortable with very settled, very orderly, very predictable environments, and new schools often are not like that. That is not to say that they need to be chaotic. But the agency required, the effort required, the fact that systems and processes are ultimately understood in terms of quite specific people doing quite specific things, reliably or otherwise, that can be, it's been my experience at least, that can be quite a disconcerting realization for some colleagues, including many who operate at a very high level of effectiveness and efficiency in more established schools. So the cultural norms associated with working in the sector will not be attuned or are not yet attuned to new or growing organizations, and therefore the structures and processes are less likely to accommodate new entrants. Since you've opened your schools, you may well have been through the often very frustrating process of getting, for example, the Department for Education to recognize your existence when it comes to registering your unique school reference number. That can take a very long time. Setting up your new school, establishing your Wi-Fi connection can take a frustratingly long time. Many of these things, whilst they might seem very mundane and humdrum, they reflect the fact that our sector is premised, almost everything about it is premised on the assumption that schools are up, they're running, they're mature, and they have been so for some time. As a particularly sort of painful personal anecdote, during my first Ofsted inspection at my first free school, I spent the best part of an hour explaining the funding framework that the SFA had in place for free schools and why that meant there were specific facilities not available to us in temporary accommodation that would be available to schools in permanent accommodation because our inspection team knew nothing about those things. Now it's not a criticism, it is an observation. So if we think about the growth journey that you are all engaged in, and it is probably worth taking a moment as I'm rattling through this to think about your sort of self-diagnosis, your individual self, where you would say you are in this journey. Schools can be thought of, having said that their experience is novel, they can be thought of as following a similar growth trajectory, a similar path to organizations in other parts of the economy. So there are many different models for this. The one that I've chosen is reasonably widely used outside of education and increasingly widely used inside education. I know, for example, that NSN using some of their work, so it may be familiar to some of you. But we move from circumstances under which you are, all of you, trying in a very visceral, very real way to establish the existence of your school. And at that point, when we talk about things like a crisis of leadership, we're really talking about your leadership. And typically that is not to be understood in terms of your individual competence or your dedication to the mission. I'd be very, very surprised if any of you had encountered any of that. But it can very much be a question of your capacity. I mean, there is so much to do on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis that it can be very difficult to sustain that pace. And I've certainly felt those pressures myself. We move from existence to survival, where growth can be achieved very significantly through direction. So let's decode that. What we mean is you are making most of the decisions and you are telling other people what to do. When you are at a very steep pace of growth in your sort of second, third year of a school's operation, there's nothing inappropriate about that being your normal mode of operation. However difficult that may be, or however that may rub against the grain of a lot of accepted cultural norms, we do have to remember that we are operating under circumstances that most professionals in our sector will never have encountered. So some degree of direction under those circumstances is entirely appropriate. Now, I would also observe, and I'm sure you will have been through this, the pandemic has often changed the relationship between stage 2 and stage 3. So although in general terms, it is truism to say that move from growth achieved through direction to growth achieved through delegation, where you as principal, as head teacher, are making fewer of those decisions, are creating more of the solution space for other people to bring to bear their professionalism, their creativity, and to determine more of the growth trajectory of your school. The pandemic did tend to arrest that process quite sharply. So I would freely admit that I felt quite strongly, and I think we had quite a lot of evidence to suggest that in my first new school, we had comfortably secured stage 3 before the pandemic hit. Not a long time before the pandemic hit, but I was pretty confident that we were solidly in the green as far as this chart was concerned. But I would also say that operating under the peculiar conditions imposed on us all by the pandemic and the resulting public health measures, it was necessary to default back to a position where there was much more direction. I provided much more direction than otherwise I would have considered to be consistent with the school at that stage of its development. I'm still comfortable that was the right decision, My colleagues of the time appeared to welcome that, and immodestly, that I felt that was a significant achievement. I received quite a lot of very positive feedback from colleagues under the circumstances. Nonetheless, I think it is important to recognise that as a particular experience of its time, and not to allow that to arrest our understanding of what the journey overall should look like. There is still the need at this stage of our growth to release the reins a little more, and to ensure that others are taking full responsibility in order that the organisation can achieve genuine maturity and genuine resilience. No matter how invested you are in your schools, or potentially at what stage of your career that you may find yourself, a very useful thought exercise is always, what comes next? You won't be there for as long as the school exists. It can't simply be a one-person project. So in thinking very explicitly in all of your planning, what happens when I'm not here? Do I genuinely have, and what happens when your senior leadership team are not there, or your founding staff are not there, as Hamid has pointed out? Do you genuinely have robust systems, or do you simply have people who are operating well, because they're simply not the same thing? We may not be at takeoff yet, given the stage at which you've opened your schools. I'm not prejudging that. Perhaps you are, but at that point, it's about coordinating highly functioning individuals operating within robust systems, and eventually growth achieved through collaboration, when you will be more open and operating in a more externally referenced way. Very similar, I would say, to the difference that I've experienced between setting up a free school and now taking over a free school, but simply at a different stage of its maturity. I would say that LAE is at the point of resource maturity, where, although we actually parenthetically have another growth spurt coming up, we are definitely moving towards a stage in which we need to be more externally referenced in order to maintain the creativity that has characterized the school to date. So just to move on from that, really, I think the focus of our discussion today should be on how we move from existence to success. And that, I think, comes down to a series of very key processes. The first is our ability to scan and evaluate the operating environment, which we've spent quite some time on. The second is to set a growth strategy. And although it's no less essential, you will be heavily involved in recruiting for growth and creating growth culture. And I think we've already heard some really powerful words of wisdom from Sir Hamid about both of those things and the importance of both of those things. So while I might touch upon it, I think we'll have less time for that this morning. So first of all, I'm going to suggest that we take about a minute and just free associate. So when you see the word strategy, what are the first words that come to mind? Please, as we do in our classrooms, there are no wrong answers. We're testing for what's already there. So can you, in the chat, post whatever comes to mind when you first see the word strategy, and we'll come back together and look at some of those in about a minute's time. Okay, so thank you for that. I mean, please, if you're still writing, continue to do so. As would be expected of a group like this, lots of really insightful stuff here. Lots about future, lots about vision, lots about planning, a lot about culture and ethos, and all very important. And what was notable is in a sense the things that also aren't there. So in a broader sense, strategy is often thought of as having something to do with power. It's thought of as having something to do with gaining different perspectives, certainly looking forward, and also something that isn't quite in the chat at the moment, something about taking and managing risk, really important. We often don't have a culture of risk taking in schools, sensible risk taking. We can be very risk averse. risk aversion at the margin is warranted, but you're going to be taking risks when you're setting up a new school, and you need to be comfortable about that and how to think through it. I'm going to relate this much more directly to work that's been done in the education space here. So I think in terms of moving forward, in terms of what we're going to address for the remaining sort of 25 minutes or so, we want to think about strategy very much in the context of the school. So Davies and Ellison produced some very powerful work in 2002, from which I've taken this quote. So strategy in their terms is the process of providing a coherent way of translating the core moral purpose of the school, its values, into action, influenced by a future's perspective and vision. And I think that's really neat. It has the considerable virtue of being quite short, but it does capture really what the core of our day jobs. What are we supposed to do as strategic leaders? And I would actually add to this an analogy with a lot of the work of Professor Michael Young. Professor Young wrote a great deal, not so long ago, sort of about 5-10 years ago, about curriculum provision and how we had lost sight in the education sector of the importance of curriculum expertise as the basis, really, for our fundamental authority in the classroom as teachers. And now, not everyone will agree with that, but I happen to. I think there is an analogy here to be drawn with the process of strategy formation and all of those dimensions when it comes to school leadership. What is the source of our authority as school leaders? Why do we get to wander around broadly speaking, pointing at things and getting people to do things for us, if it is not because we are able to do these things, if it is not because we are the custodians of that moral purpose, and we are able to translate that moral purpose into action, influenced by a future's perspective, and through collaboration with our colleagues. I think that's a really important point of reflection. So just to break that down again into something a little more operational in the school's context, it does mean that we are fundamentally concerned with our core values. And again, referring back to Hamid's comments earlier, what are we about? What are we about as individuals? What are we about as a school? How are we going to translate those core values, that vision, that sense of mission, into policies, into practices, into procedures? How will we know that those things are happening on a day-to-day basis? Will we really, really consider each of those decisions that we make, many of them very difficult, in light of those core values? So when we are faced with challenging HR situations, are we relating those situations explicitly, not just in terms of our own reflection and decision making, but explicitly relating those decisions back to the core values that are the underpinning of everything we do as individuals and the reason for our school's existence? Because if we are not, then we can't expect that the specific plans and actions that we come up with will reflect or husband the school's mission. Now, you have handily avoided all of these in your comments in the chat, but nonetheless, I think it's worth fleshing out the fact that many people, when you say the word strategy, have certain assumptions. The first is that strategy is hierarchical. So leaders, bluntly, typically in a school, the head teacher or principal, will form a strategy and others will follow it. The second is that strategy is a particular type of activity that is more impactful, matters more, than other types of activity that take place elsewhere in the organization, so reinforcing that sense of hierarchy. And finally is the idea that strategy is deliberate and unchanging, and therefore to revise one's strategy is to admit its failure. Now, we don't have time to demolish all of these things in as thorough and methodical way as I might like, but I'm going to address them all right now. I think these are all misapprehensions. It is not true that strategy is necessarily hierarchical. It is not true that it is necessarily more impactful than other things might happen inside a school. And it is definitely not true that strategy is deliberate or unchanging. My favorite quote or reflection on strategic planning comes from Dwight D. Eisenhower, and I believe it was a reflection on the process of planning the Normandy landings. His observation was that plans were useless, but that planning was essential. What I think he was trying to conjure up there or capture was the sense that planning is a mindset, strategy is a mindset. It is very often the case that, to labour the military analogy, Your plans don't necessarily, in all cases, survive contact with the enemy, but the process of preparation and the ability, the mental architecture that one will have developed, and in some cases, the institutional architecture one will have developed in order to form those plans, is the thing that will allow you to move to the next level, to meet the next challenge. So just to develop that idea slightly more, there are, in wider literature concerning organizational strategy, there are two, characterizing slightly, there are two broad types of strategy. So there is purposeful direction or deliberate strategy, where essentially you make a plan, you execute that plan in more or less the manner that you expected, and that produces outcomes. The second is what's called emergent strategy, and that is where, as a result of the ongoing operation of your institution, in this case your school, strategy emerges from activity. Now that will typically mean that you are capturing all of the creativity and good ideas, excellent practice that have taken place within your school, and constantly using that to reinforce your own process of strategy formation. And drawing upon the work of Mintzberg, mixing deliberate and emergent strategies, so essentially having a sensible balance between those strategic processes which are somewhat top-down, which tend to more directly involve yourself, your senior leadership team, your governors, and we'll come on to, mixing those sorts of strategies with strategy that emerges from the school more widely, from your staffing body, potentially from other stakeholders, including parents, very definitely, from your wider teaching team and other professionals working in the school. That is the most secure way in which you can have a truly robust, constantly evolving strategy for your school that will allow you to realize your vision. And I'm going to step one step forward, and then I'm going to hand this over to you for a few minutes. So I'm going to argue that there are three dimensions to an effective school strategy, or three forms of challenges that you will want to consider and eventually overcome. There are cohort challenges. So there are those factors relating to your specific cohort which will test the school, for whom you will need solutions, for whom you will need ongoing, potentially evolving challenges, ongoing, potentially evolving strategies. There are environmental challenges. So thinking about the schools sector as a whole, there will be challenges which you have to face, but which you are facing under slightly different circumstances. As a new school, you will experience those challenges differently, and you will, in some cases, have less capacity to meet those challenges, but in some cases you may also have offsetting advantages. You may be more agile, you may be more creative, you may have the ability to change your systems more quickly, more creatively than more established, more heavily resourced schools. And then there are institutional challenges. So there are those challenges that arise from building capacity over time under some fairly unusual circumstances. So what I'm going to ask us to do, and I am reliant on Hannah and Graham to put you into 6 different breakout groups, is I'm going to ask that you spend about, let's call it, Hannah, do we have enough time to allow for 7 minutes for this?
Yeah. Let's do that.
Excellent, thank you. So we're going to break into 6 different groups. I'm going to ask that groups 1 and 2 address the environmental factors. So drawing upon those instructions at the top of the slide, try to identify 3 or 4 factors in addition to the 2 that I've given you just to start the discussion. Think about how each of those factors might affect new schools differently, or perhaps has affected your school differently than a more established school, and how new schools might address those factors differently. And then, surprisingly enough, I'm going to ask groups 3 and 4 to do the same for institutional factors, and then groups 5 and 6 to do the same for cohort factors. Again, starting with the stimulus that's included on the slide, but also very much thinking through other factors that may be specific to your context and which will be useful to share to your group, so that you can learn from one another. Okay, with that, I'm going to pause. I'm going to ask Hannah to put you into your breakout groups, and we'll come back together in about 7 minutes. Thank you.
Right, thanks everyone. We're just bringing everyone back into the main session. Might take a second or two. Right, there we go. I think we've got most people back now, Alex.
Okay, thank you. Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully, each of the groups will have received a message from Hannah, and every group will have a spokesperson ready just to feedback on the nature of their discussion. For no particular reason, can we do this in reverse order? I know that we combine groups 5 and 6. So could the spokesperson for group 5 and 6 make themselves known and give us sort of 30 seconds to a minute on your discussion, please?
Well, we didn't nominate a spokesperson, but I must admit I have to stand up to the plate because I dominated the process, trying to understand the process. So I apologise for that, because cohort as a definition was something I was just trying to understand around. Was that stakeholder led? Is that around cohort in the respect of role models and, you know, best practice, etc., etc. So we did actually get a little bit waylaid, so I wanted to put an apology in quickly to the rest of the people that were in our group, but we didn't actually get that message that you referred to, Alex. So I think we were talking about cohorts and some of the considerations around, you know, who were the stakeholders, one of the things that we need to be conscious of, and whether or not having a primary school and a secondary school is good news because you've got role models and you can set behaviors already, or actually having just a single school at the moment, maybe that's also an advantage because you've already got your cultural values and some of your principles in place. And then if you do grow, then actually you're growing already some of those values or some of those beliefs. And that was some of the challenges. I mean, I'm non-exec of a school, so I'm not actually somebody that's come from education, so I apologize. So it was really getting our minds around that particular issue. And in turn, obviously, I'm a non-exec of a school that's already got a waiting list. So that's quite a challenge around, you know, that's an important consideration when you do grow, is how you match and how that you look at what some of your beliefs are already and what would happen if you took on another school.
No, I think that's, I think that is dominated or otherwise. I mean, those are valuable reflections. I mean, we will have unusual circumstances as new school leaders. The fact whether or not your school is full or oversubscribed is a fairly key consideration. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that's not that will ever be a less important consideration for a school as it matures. But you just have much less road as a new school. A more established school might go through many years of difficulty, not to underestimate that, being insensitive to it in any way with regard to student roll. But if you have successive years of challenge with student roll under the current environment, it has to be said, the chances of the school surviving are very limited. Now, that's a new development. Probably wouldn't have said that even in the early stages of the free school movement, where, as colleagues will know, there were a number of schools that started out with really very, very small numbers of students, many of which have gone on to mature and to be successful. I don't think that degree of experimentation, I don't think there's any appetite for that degree of experimentation over that sort of timescale in the system any longer. But anyway, sorry, in the interest of time, could we go to group 4?
Hi, we didn't nominate a spokesperson. I don't mind discussing what we discussed as a group. I hope we did the right thing. We talked about sort of staffing and maybe the issues of that in relation to setting up a new school. So we all talked about our context in terms of how many children we started with and where we are now, how many years we've been opened. But sort of some of the things that were coming out was the staffing, the impact of the pandemic. Some of us opened schools during the pandemic, some opened just before. So how that affected your staffing and how your vision doesn't want to be diluted. So the more you do it, the more you take on staff. So some on the group talked about that. Someone talked about how they grew a lot of their own staff, so to speak. So your NQT, schools direct. So ultimately they knew the vision because they were in place there to start off with. And then it talked about getting your leadership and your systems in place as well, because once new staff start, it's okay appointing your teachers, your TAs, but actually have you got like your inclusion manager, have you got your Senko, and and do you need 2 Senkos because of the size of your school, etc. One gentleman talked about how the vision had changed because his leadership had changed in his school, so the head teacher had left, and then people were buying more into the school's vision now than before. So as the head left, a lot of staff left. So how the vision changed there, as a summary.
Thank you for that, Catherine. So that wasn't a reflection on one of my old schools, was it?
No,
okay.
it wasn't critical either. It was just more that the vision had changed. So, people were buying into an amended vision. Yeah.
No, yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I'm sure you will all be conscious of the average tenure in post of new school heads, which we don't need to spend time on now. Can we just talk before I say anything more? Can we maybe go to group 3 as well?
I think I was part of group 3. We were quite a small group because we kind of lost one member of staff. We kind of thought about it. I mean, first of all, we spoke about our culture and our visions, you know, how as schools grow, you know, keeping that original culture, that original vision you want to take with you, not allowing it to become diluted. But then we kind of moved on to our cohort of students, because, you know, as a special school, we have different departments, which is what I spoke about, and so did someone else on the thing. And how our intake, our cohorts was changing our direction slightly from our initial ideas when we started. However, we are now becoming oversubscribed. So, you know, we are going, you know, we are pulling back to that original vision and strategies we had in place.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think what was coming out of that is both the factor of change. So yeah. So the idea that you know, where we start the direction of travel, you know, that may remain the same, you know, assuming there were solid foundations, but the pathway that we follow might change quite considerably. How we achieve those objectives could change quite considerably over the lifespan of a school. I mean, just as a broad reflection, it was my experience, and I would still say that it's a fairly typical experience, that in terms of you know, the growth process, preserving culture through the growth process, sort of induction and other things. I think that's more difficult, but also more essential with staff than it is with students. I was part of the process of ramping up, as far as students were concerned, was relatively straightforward, as long as you had got the staff induction right and the sort of staff culture right.
And to be honest, we spoke about that quite heavily, and we spoke about how we really do it on our first inset day, but maybe something we just need to be revisiting continuously, and not just having that big focus on the first day back in the summer term.
Yeah, that's a really key point. I mean, just an operational takeaway, that is a really key point. I mean, that induction needs to be incredibly high quality. You need to come back to it. You assume it's a one-time exercise. Yeah. It is not. It's also, of course, incredibly valuable for existing staff to be part of that.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay,
let's move on to groups 1 and 2. I guess in the order in the reverse order that we've established. So let's move on to group 2.
We got the message about electing somebody, but I don't think we got as far as doing it. So I'm having to talk quickly, and if anybody wants to chip anything in. Our group was 3 special schools and 1 secondary, and 2 of which had almost been open for a year. They're approaching their anniversary in April. And then the secondary had only just been open since September. Environment's obviously a huge title, but we inevitably spoke about some of the things around COVID and recruitment of both pupils and staff. It was interesting. You mentioned that it's all new, and therefore even the experience of the people who've opened before is quite new, and the people who are called education experts that we work with. For example, in our context, we are oversubscribed, massively oversubscribed as a secondary school, and nobody believed that could possibly be possible. And so it was quite difficult in terms of getting through that environment of convincing people that your context might be quite different from others. Then conversely, one of the other people on the call was sort of grateful for the fact that in the context of COVID, their local authority had guaranteed them some funding. So even if the pupil recruitment wasn't there, they knew they had a solid foundation from which to go forwards. And then we spoke about how you get people to feel like they're part of something when you may not have a building yet, and some of the strategies that we'd employed around, you know, what we do in replacement of the physical environment to make people feel that they were welcomed into an environment where people knew what they were doing and they could feel reassured when they were coming into a context that was different from any other that they probably ever worked in. I spoke really quickly there just in case anybody else that was in our group wants to unmute and say anything in addition to that, but I think that captures what we said.
No, that was very clear, Michael. Thank you. Can we just hear from Group 1 before I offer any kind of reaction? Thank you.
Hello. Kate very kindly nominated me to be our spokesperson, but there were only 2 of us in the group, so I will go ahead. Again, we had similar theme to what Michael has spoken about. We didn't get onto Ofsted, but we did talk about COVID and kind of the impact of that. Firstly, in terms of staffing, and, you know, if you end up with a few out, it has a huge impact when you are a very small school. So when you spoke earlier, Alex, about being very small, that's the situation that I'm in. Started at 25, moved to 50, mine's a special school. And then we talked about the restrictions around temporary accommodation with ventilation, etc., and old buildings and how that fits into it. But I think essentially what the crux of it was that it swings and roundabouts, really. You know, there are the positives, but there are also the difficulties and the challenges that we need to kind of look at and manage. And that's the same for new or established. They're just different. Katie, please come in and let me know if I'm wrong, but I think that was where we summarised too.
Yeah, sorry, we did summarise that. There was one thing that we said, there was, because in the nature of new schools, often you have staff that are really willing to step up to the plate, do whatever you need. They're often people that are really hands-on. So actually, with COVID, where you've had to collapse classes or do something, people are putting their hand up to really volunteer and do those things, and that's been really helpful and really great, and it brings your community together.
Thank you both for that. I mean, I have to say, I mean, that last point, I mean, that was my experience also of dealing with COVID. It was I mean, my last school, we were in a position where there were 2 secondary schools in the trust, one very established, one new, and they were physically fairly close to one another. And I think, no disrespect intended to anyone, but I think the new school was much more able, in the very short term, was much more able to deal with the operational challenges presented by COVID. I think that was mostly because everybody who was already on platform was used to change. I mean, they were used to, they'd been in temporary accommodation. It was sort of odd. It wasn't quite the row of terraced houses that Hamid mentioned earlier, but it was a repurposed, very dilapidated primary school building, moving from which we all had to access via minibuses in the morning, moving into a brand spanking new, very large building, which we had to keep replanning every year because obviously our physical occupancy changed. I think people were just in the habit of dealing with those things. I mean, we had a little chat while you were all in your breakout groups. I mean, I think we won't have time to do justice to the topic of governance, but so we'll park that. Also, I don't want to there's an element of death by slideware if we try and go through that at pace. So we won't address that explicitly. But I did just want to pick up on a comment that Michael made there that I think is I have found in talking with other sort of heads of newer schools is a more common challenge than not, and that is where assumptions on the part of existing stakeholders, often, if I'm being honest, in governance or often within a multi-academy trust environment or local authority environment, regarding context, it can be very difficult to shift. So it's very common that somewhere in the process of setting up a new school, there are sort of vested interests that feel that they know what that looks like, and I have to say that the people who are most at risk of having formed that view are typically those people who've never done it. So that can be quite challenging. I think as it's certainly something I know that I wrestle with as a founding head, trying to make the point in a sufficiently diplomatic way that there were going to be differences and that those differences would require differences in approach, differences in systems and structures, and that those differences were not critical commentary on whatever may have happened elsewhere. I think that's a real challenge. It can be a real challenge for, and also of course you have the whole issue of then, you know, your community, depending on your context, may also perceive those differences. How do you explain that? I mean, just as a sort of semi-final reflection, I think that is one of the peculiar challenges of opening a new school. It's sort of pursuing sensible difference, which is right for your cohort, but also making sure that you take all of your stakeholders with you in recognizing that the difference isn't necessarily, you know, bad or a reason for concern. Okay, I mean, I think we are almost exactly on time if we pause there. So
indeed, thank you so much, Alex. Thank you very much. That was incredibly useful and I'm sure really valuable for everybody to sort of get their heads together as well and discuss those sort of common challenges as well. We're just going to put a quick poll up. If you could just give us a quick bit of feedback before you head off. Thank you for your time today. I've just put a reminder in the chat about our session on Tuesday, which is around safeguarding. Please do sign up for that if you haven't done so already. If you are on our NSN Hub, please also do take the time to fill out our survey, which is currently live. And if you're not on the NSN Hub, then we can make sure that you have an invite to join that platform for all of our free school leaders as a place to network and get access to some of our resources as well. Yes, Cameron will share the slides as well, and so that will have some of the content that we didn't get time to go over on today as well, so you'll have that for reference. And as I say, we're recording these sessions and we'll be uploading them in due course as well, so that you'll have the full recording to access. Lovely, thanks very much again to our speakers and thank you to everybody for attending.